It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. We're in our third of four segments this morning. You've caught us halfway into the show. If you're just joining us, glad to have you on board. AVN runs every morning from 8 to about 9:45 a.m. Live on americasvoicenow.org and on patriotfb.com and a number of other sites where our program streams. We have an audio feed through Spreaker. That's like speaker with an R. And then on Patriot FB, you can listen through a live audio feed as well. So we encourage you to participate with us and do that because gives you an opportunity to catch the show live. If you cannot catch it live, there's two different ways that you can hear it. You can catch us on Rooster Radio, Big Country 99, every night from midnight to 2. And then you can also call our listen line, which is a completely free service for you. It is a toll call, so just make sure that you call it from a phone where you don't have to pay by the minute in order to get on there. That phone number is area code 415-325-0725. Again, that listen line number is 415-325-0725. I'd also love to hear from you directly. If you have an interest in contacting me, by all means, please send me an email. You can send it to Mike at americasvoicenow.org. That's Mike at americasvoicenow.org. We do look forward to getting email from you because it kind of keeps us informed as to what your thought process is and how you're receiving the information that we are out there providing for you. There are no FCC monitors here, at least yet, and I can tell you that if the day ever comes when they say you got to have an FCC monitor in every radio host's studio, that I will stop doing the show. So the subject that we're going to tackle this morning on this segment, and our fourth segment later will be what is DLE terrorism and why is it an epidemic in America? DLE stands for Domestic Law Enforcement Terrorism. And we have a rash of police brutality and police state tactics being used on Americans across the board, and we're going to tackle that in our fourth segment. But in this particular one, turns out that for quite some time now, the Army has been aware that their M4 carbine has had, a fairly deplorable reliability record under sustained full automatic fire and or poor maintenance by whoever troop is using it, but they've been kind of keeping this under their hat. And of course, it's really been kind of difficult for word to get out so that people would be able to. And of course, when you're in the Army, there's not much you can do. Your hands are kind of tied, right? I mean, you can only deal with the weapon they give you. You can't bring one from home. So, but there are individuals within the military who have actually been purchasing their own parts, which they're, of course, legally forbidden from doing. But the attitude from them is, I'd rather get, carried by, I would rather be, heard in a court-martial and judged by six rather than be buried by six. And so these are men in Afghanistan. These are men in Iraq. These are men in special forces and, SOCOM units all over the world. And so essentially the problem that they're having is with the M4A1, which is the military's standard issue carbine. And there are some specific problems that appear to be cropping up with these. And the reason that I wanted to touch on this topic with you this morning is because that the idea of the AR-15 being, less than ideally reliable, if you will, is certainly problematic for most Americans, for the simple reason that most people out there who are looking for a weapon for home and family protection, we're not talking about carry pistols now, we're talking about carbines, right? And they have a AR-15 carbine. And so when we talk about that, that means that there's an enormous, there are millions of these out there in the marketplace. And, if you're, because you don't have, and you don't put it to the same level of use that the military puts theirs to in terms of consistent usage of fire. I mean, unless you're practicing every day or training, weekly, and you're shooting multiple rounds through this thing, you may never see these particular failures until, of course, you need the gun at its most necessary period. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where the rub comes, because that's not where you want your weapon to fail you. Now, apparently what's happening is there are some specific parts of the weapon, and it's mostly in the trigger guard area or triggers and the tube, the gas feed tube that runs across the top. And you'll generally not see that if you're not really familiar with an AR-15 and its makeup and its parts. That particular piece is not something that you'll necessarily see because it's underneath the handguard. And so, but it's a little tube, and it's very small. It's the size of a pipe cleaner, and it's about so long. And that particular tube, it's got a kind of a funny bent to it. Sometimes you'll see them with a pigtail. The idea is that that particular tube, when the bullet passes down the barrel, and as it passes behind it, there's a pile of built-up gas that's pushing that bullet forward, right, from the explosion of ejecting it from the end of the shell. And as that bullet passes through, there's a little tiny hole in the barrel, and that gas goes up and into that tube and comes back and forces the bolt to slide back so that the next round can be lifted up by the magazine, and then the next round can be slid into place in the chamber. Fire a second time. Well, under sustained full auto fire or extensive use, they're finding that there are problems with that tube because it clogs or it has problems where it melts down, and that there are barrels failing, and there are problems with M4s jamming during battle, and these jams are causing major problems for our individuals overseas. These in one of the independent surveys comes back with the quote that these stoppages are having a quote unquote large impact. So what's happening is some of these soldiers have been modifying their own weaponry. Now, the other challenge that they've had, and I've said this about the M4 all along, is that it has a limited range. A .223 caliber bullet is very very small. By its name, a .223 is the same size diameter bullet as a .22. The same .22 you learned how to shoot with or went out squirrel hunting with last week. I learned how to plink with. That .22 caliber bullet is quite a bit larger for a military M4 carbine or a .223 or 5.56, and those terms are synonymous and interchangeable for the most part. There are some limitations on that, and you gun guys, don't send me email and give me a 3-page dissertation on the difference between .223 and 5.56. I already know it. But this is a conversation for those who aren't thoroughly understanding of the issue. And so it's a fairly heavy bullet there in the 55 to 62 grain weight versus a 22 being, 40 grains. And there's a lot of powder behind it. And that means that the bullet moves very, very quickly. However, out at, beyond 250 yards, it effectively has no power. And if somebody's wearing armor or a bulletproof jacket or they're behind any kind of cover whatsoever, there's a very, very good chance that the bullet will never actually penetrate. And so what they're finding is that once you've gotten beyond 250 yards, the killing power of this particular bullet is non-existent. And so they're hitting these guys at these long ranges, and for all intents and purposes, they're not taking them out. Now, you know, in Iraq, where we first went in, and you recall we were in Afghanistan, but then we went over and jumped in on Iraq too, where that was like more like house-to-house urban fighting. The 223 is more suited for that environment, or suitable, because of the short distances that you're ordinarily firing, no more than 100 yards. But in Afghanistan, where you've got these broad open areas, it's a challenge for them. That's why, you know, back in Vietnam, when the M16 was first introduced, the troops were pretty unhappy with the whole idea, or at least a lot of them were, and they wanted to stick with the old M14 because that was a .308 caliber cartridge, which one had a lot more power, two had a lot more distance, and you know, is a very, very flat shooting rifle. So essentially, here's what the long and the short of this is, because I don't want to get too sidetracked on all of the history. But the real issue here is that many of these troops are finding that they really need to replace some of the parts in the weapon with their own parts so that they can feel confident that the weapon is not going to fail on them when they need it the most. And I would strongly encourage you to do the same. Now, there's a number of places where you can obtain high quality parts and good gear. One of them is Brownells. Brownells has, perhaps been one of the, but remember, Brownells doesn't make anything, right? They only sell other people's products. So don't get caught or hung up looking for a Brownells, name branded product. But they do have a lot of products that are available. But to be honest with you, with the advent and the volume of AR rifles that are out there now, there's a lot of vendors out there. In fact, I gave you one in a link that you can go to, and that's Red River Guns, REDRIVER Guns, GUNS. And basically all they sell is parts and replacement parts. So if you want to buy a trigger set, if you want to buy washers, if you want to buy springs, if you want to buy one of those little piston gas tubes, if you want to buy a replacement, a gas port on the front and things like that, they've got those parts. Green Mountain Defense Industries is another one. Green Mountain Defense Industries. And this is one of the organizations that named in this article that, they've been, the troops have been purchasing their own gear from. Now, of course, let's be candid, they're not allowed to do this. But again, the point is, if I've got to take a risk of getting a court-martial versus a risk of being shot by the enemy, I think I'm going to opt for the risk of a court-martial. So the other aspect of AR-15s, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, is that, when you're talking about very dusty and dirty conditions and a lot of sand, they don't perform as well as they might. So the idea of pristine cleaning and maintenance of those weapons is very, very important. And any AR-15 is a fairly high maintenance weapon. But remember that it's a weapon that for relatively shorter distances is ideal. It's got a high magazine capacity, and at the same point in time, it's lightweight. The ammunition is lightweight, so guys can carry more of it into the field when they're on a deployment where they don't have access to resupply and materiel from the rear and so forth and so on. So there was a lot of reasons why the M4, M16, whatever you want to call it, is a valuable and certainly meets the needs of certain situations. My suggestion, if you're going to have an AR-15, and probably most of the people listening to this either do or they've got one, or either have one or have access to one, would be that you have a series and a group of spare parts available to replace. In some cases, if there's trigger failure or trigger problems, then you can simply just replace that particular piece, or depending upon how you want to accomplish it, you can actually get a trigger that literally you just drop right in, put one pin through the side of the receiver, and you're done. That's a brand new trigger, and it's, these are match grade, high quality triggers, right? So those are options for you. You can always keep around A trigger assembly in an AR-15 is made up of a group of parts. There's a trigger and a hammer and a sear and, so forth and so on. Springs. You need to have at least one complete second set of those for every weapon that you have. And you should have, if it's at all possible, at least one extra bolt around where you can utilize that bolt for any one of a number of AR-15s that you may have. So if you've got a couple of AR-15s in your household, you probably don't need to buy an extra bolt for each one, but having an extra bolt around when you got multiple weapons is not a bad idea. Those bolts are available, and they can be purchased anywhere from about, a bolt and carrier. You want the whole bolt and carrier assembly. That particular piece is probably in the $75 to $150 range, depending upon what you buy. You can buy a $300 one if you want to go nuts, but that's up to you. So my point to you is this. You want to make sure that you have extractors, extra extractors. That's that little piece with a little flanged edge on it that catches the back of the case, the rim of the case, and pulls that bullet back out of the chamber and ejects it, right? That you should have an extra extractor and an extra ejector and extra springs for the weapon. And you can buy whole kits that is like what's called a lower parts kit. And that parts kit will give you basically all the springs and the pins and the, all the parts that you would need to effectively repair and or maintain any given AR weapon. And they're interchangeable. So it doesn't matter whether you have a Colt or whether you've got, a Bushmaster or whether you've got one by Smith & Wesson or whether it doesn't make any difference. AR-15s are built, at least for the most part. There are a couple of exceptions out there. But for the vast majority of AR-15s, you're talking about a single parts kit that will be virtually usable for any weapon, any AR-15 weapon. And so my point to you is this. I talk to a lot of folks who prepare, and they prepare food, and they buy ammunition, and they have weaponry, and they stockpile medicine, and things like that. Well, what I'm trying to get you to remember, or to remind you of doing here, is that it's not enough when you have failed to set aside spare parts as well, because things will break. And whether it's spare parts for a tractor, or if you are living off grid and you're trying, you're going to need spare parts for your solar system that pumps the water out of your well, or if you're hand pumping it, make sure that you are mindful of the fact that these products can break. And when they do break, you may not necessarily be able to get spare parts. So now's the time for you to be taking advantage of the opportunity for you to get onto the internet and research good pricing and vast options that are available to you. I gave you a couple of names before, and I would encourage you to go out there and do your own homework and research. Again, it's Green Mountain Defense Industries. You can go to Brownells, or you can go to Red River Guns. And again, the lower parts kit is a fairly inexpensive option, and it gives you a full, complete set of all the springs and all of those things. So keeping one of those on hand, you may well find. And I got to tell you, in this report that they're looking here, and they had testing that was done by numerous entities, including the Picatinny Arsenal and so forth and so on. They were finding that the recoil buffers, the extractor springs, the trigger assemblies, and in some cases the magazines and the bolts, and in some cases even the barrel and the chambers themselves were failing. So don't get caught short is what I'm trying to say. Now, you're talking here, of course, about weapons that are firing at under a fully automatic load, which is a much higher cyclical rate, and it creates an enormous amount of heat and stress on the weapon. Most people, 99.99999% of the AR-15s out there, are not going to be fully automatic. And so, it's unlikely that you're going to sit there and melt down your barrel like you could with an M4 in a hot firefight somewhere in Fallujah. But we are talking about incidents where we're talking about as little as 850 rounds fired. Now, that's not an enormous high volume of rounds. Certainly not in a situation where you may find yourself protecting your home and your family for some extended window or period of time. And so don't be caught short. What I'm trying to make you understand here is that it's important and critical for you to have spares on hand, not just for your rifles and your pistols. I'm using this story as an example for you so that you recognize how important it is to make sure that you've got spare magazines, the springs within those magazines. It's not a bad idea to have some extras. And, and it's not limited, of course, just to the issues of, AR-15s or weaponry. It can be a lot of things, including, like I mentioned before, a well that's, a hand-pumped well, or some piece of machinery that you might rely on. If you've got a windmill, as an example, that's generating or pumping water for you, or any of those issues, you got to have spare parts on hand. Because if they fail when you need them the most, they're going to do you absolutely no good, and many spares will likely not be available to you, at least immediately or in any reasonable period of time. So, with that being said, will your AR-15 fail you when you need it most? Maybe not, but you're always better off to be prepared. So don't overlook that. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we return, we're going to come back and talk about our final topic this morning, which is, what is domestic law enforcement terrorism, and why has it become an epidemic in the United States?